Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the demand and supply model. This model is powerful because it explains how prices are determined in a market economy. Whenever you buy gasoline, groceries, or pay rent, the prices you face are the result of the interaction between demand and supply. Understanding this model gives you insight into incentives like how consumers react when prices rise or fall, and how firms adjust their production decisions. We also use the demand and supply framework to explain important macroeconomic variables. For example, in the labor market, demand and supply determine wages and unemployment. In financial markets, they determine the interest rate. Finally, once this foundation is clear, it becomes the building block for the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which we will use later. To understand demand and supply more formally, we begin with a simple mathematical idea, a function. A function is a rule that connects an input to an output. Think of a vending machine. You put in money, you select the product, and the machine gives you the output. In economics, we model relationship the same way. In the demand and supply model, the input is price, the output is quantity. So every point on the demand or supply curve represents the quantity demanded or supplied given a specific price. This function idea helped us, graphic behavior and, to understand how markets move. Now let's define the concept of demand. Demand refers to amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price level. Willing means people want the product. Able means they have the income or resources to buy it. Price is the amount that the buyer pays for one unit of the good. Quantity demanded is the number of units consumers want to purchase at a specific price. The key idea is that the demand is not just one number. It's a relationship showing how quantity demand changes when price changes. Here is the demand curve, which shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. On the graph, price is on the vertical axis, quantity is on the horizontal axis. The demand curve slopes downward, reflecting the law of demand. When price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. When price decreases, quantity demanded increases. If the price rises from P0 to P1, quantity demanded falls from Q0 to Q1. If the price falls from P0 to P2, quantity demanded rises from Q0 to Q2. And a demand schedule is a table that lists the different prices and the corresponding quantity demanded at each price. This table provides the data that we later plot on a graph to form the demand curve. It shows how consumers respond at each price point. The table is a numerical representation of the law of the demand. Okay, the right graph shows a demand curve from demand schedule. Each pair of price and quantity demanded becomes a point on price quantity space. Connecting these points forms the demand curve. This helps visualize the inverse pattern. Higher prices correspond to lower quantities demanded, and lower prices correspond to higher quantities demanded. Now let's switch to the producer side and define supply. Supply is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at each price level. Price represents the revenue the seller receives per unit sold. Quantity supplied is the number of units firms are ready to produce at a given price. Producers respond to the incentives, like higher prices mean higher revenue, which often encourages them to produce more. The supply curve illustrates the relationship between price and quantity supplied. On this graph as well, price is on the vertical axis, the quantity is on the horizontal axis. The supply curve slopes upward, reflecting the law of supply. As price increases from P0 to P1, the quantity supplied increases from Q0 to Q1. As price decreases from P0 to P2, the quantity supplied decreases from Q0 to Q2. A supply schedule is a table that lists the different prices and the quantity producer are willing to supply at each price. Just like with demand, this table will be used for plotting the supply curve. Here we convert the supply schedule into a supply curve. Each pair of price and quantity supplied forms a point, and connecting those points gives the upward sloping supply curve. The upward slope means the law of supply. A higher price leads to a higher quantity supply. Now we bring both sides together, demand and supply, to understand market equilibrium. Equilibrium occurs at the point where the demand curve and supply curve intersect. At this price and quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. There's no shortage and no surplus, which means buyers and sellers have no incentive to change their behavior. The equilibrium price is the market clearing price, and the equilibrium quantity is the amount exchanged at that price. Any movement away from equilibrium creates economic pressure that pushes the market back toward equilibrium. In this example, the demand and supply curves intersect at the point E. The equilibrium price is $1.40 per gallon, and the equilibrium quantity is 600 million gallons. At this price, consumers want to buy exactly the same amount producers want to sell. This is the stable point of the market. You know, and sometimes the market is not at equilibrium. At a price below equilibrium, let's say, $1.20, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Quantity demanded is 700 units, while quantity supplied is only 550 units. This creates excess demand or a shortage of 150 units. When shortage occurred, consumers compete for the limited goods, often bidding up the price. This pushes the market back toward equilibrium. At a price over equilibrium, let's say $1.80, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. The producers supply 680 million gallons, while consumers only want 500 million gallons. This results in excess supply. or a surplus of 180 units. When there is a surplus, sellers lower their prices to attract buyers. This downward pressure on price moves the market back to the equilibrium. It is important to distinguish between moving along a curve versus shifting the entire curve. Previously, we talked about points moving along the curves. However, in this situation, things that move are the entire curves. Demand or supply refers to the whole curve. Quantity demanded or quantity supplied refers to a specific point on the curve, depending on a specific price. When price changes, the point moves along the curve. However, when non-price factors change, like income, preference, technology, or input costs, the entire curve shifts. Here's an example of a demand shift. When income increases, the consumers can afford to buy more. This increases demand at every price level. For example, at the same price P0, the quantity demanded increases from Q0 to Q1. The entire demand curve shifts to the right from D to D prime. A rightward shift means the higher demand, and a leftward shift means lower demand. Now we look at a supply shift. If production costs increased, for example, input prices or labor costs, firms will require a higher price to supply the same quantity. This pushes the supply curve upward or to the left from S to S prime. At the same quantity, the new required prices is higher from P0 to P1. And a rightward shift in supply indicates more supply. A leftward shift indicates a reduced supply. Here is a table to summarize the key factors that shape the curves. Common factors to affect demand include income changes, consumer preference, population, prices of related goods, or expectation of future prices. And common supply shifters include input costs, technology, number of producers, taxes and regulations, or expectation of future prices. So understanding these shifters is essential because the real-world market changes constantly due to these factors. Thank you for your attention.